In a sleek Silicon Valley boardroom, a brilliant financial analyst was about to challenge her CEO's authority. What started as a routine quarterly presentation took a shocking turn when she came face to face with systematic silencing and professional gaslighting. Charlotte Schmidt wasn't your typical corporate employee. For 18 months, she had spent her life meticulously analyzing VelocityPay's explosive growth, known for her Stanford-trained precision and unwavering moral compass. When she discovered encrypted files revealing a sophisticated Ponzi scheme, she had no idea she was walking into a web of international fraud worth hundreds of millions. Her decision to become an FBI informant would lead to the downfall of a tech empire and forever change how whistleblowers are protected in corporate America. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Charlotte Schmidt's fingers hovered over the mute button on her laptop as David Thornfield's voice filled the conference room with its practiced charm. She'd rehearsed her quarterly financial analysis 3 times that morning, triple-checked every figure, and prepared for the inevitable questions about user acquisition costs that kept her awake at night. The numbers told a story that made her stomach churn, but she'd learned to present facts with surgical precision. No emotion, no interpretation, just data. "Charlotte, you're up," David said, his smile never reaching his eyes as he gestured toward the massive wall-mounted screen. The same smile he'd used 6 months ago when this nightmare began. She cleared her throat and began. "The Q3 financials show some concerning trends in our customer acquisition costs. We're seeing a 340% increase in..." Click. Her microphone cut out mid-sentence. "Sorry, technical difficulties?" David said smoothly, his finger casually lifting from his laptop's trackpad. "Why don't you email the team your findings afterward?" "Marcus, tell us about the new user onboarding flow." Marcus Williams shot her an apologetic glance from across the mahogany table, his young face flushed with the uncomfortable awareness that he was being used as a redirect. But he obediently launched into his presentation while Charlotte sat frozen, her carefully prepared words dissolving into the recycled air of VelocityPay's pristine conference room. This was meeting number 24. Charlotte had started counting after the first month, when she realized the pattern wasn't coincidental. Every time she tried to present data that didn't align with David's narrative of explosive growth, something happened. A microphone malfunction. An urgent call that required immediate attention. A sudden pivot to another agenda item. The other executives, all men except for Jessica Park, who seemed to exist in her own carefully constructed bubble, had long since stopped noticing. Or pretending to notice. "Brilliant work, Marcus," David was saying now, his voice warm with the kind of approval Charlotte hadn't heard directed at her in months. "Your insights about user engagement really complement what Charlotte discovered about acquisition efficiency." Charlotte blinked. She hadn't mentioned acquisition efficiency. She'd been trying to explain why their acquisition costs were spiraling out of control, suggesting the very opposite of efficiency. But somehow, in David's retelling, her concerns had been transformed into validation of his strategies. "Actually," she began, reaching for her microphone, "I think there might be some confusion about..." "Great point, Charlotte," David interrupted, his finger already moving toward his laptop. "Let's table the details for now and focus on the big picture. Jessica, walk us through the marketing projections." The rest of the meeting blurred past in a haze of corporate speak and carefully orchestrated enthusiasm. Charlotte took notes mechanically, her handwriting growing more jagged with each disruptive innovation and paradigm shift that rolled off David's tongue. She watched Jessica present user engagement metrics that somehow never quite aligned with the financial data Charlotte analyzed. She listened to Marcus describe technical capabilities that seemed disconnected from the revenue streams they supposedly supported. When the meeting finally ended, Charlotte gathered her materials with practiced efficiency, avoiding eye contact as the other executives filed out, already absorbed in their phones and their next appointments. Only Marcus lingered, pretending to organize his notes until they were alone. "That was..." he started, then trailed off, running a hand through his disheveled brown hair. "Normal," Charlotte finished quietly. "That was normal." Quote. Marcus's face crumpled with the kind of earnest frustration that reminded Charlotte why she'd gravitated toward him in the first place. At 24, he still believed that good work spoke for itself, that merit mattered more than politics. His idealism was both refreshing and heartbreaking in equal measure. "It's not right," he said. "You've been here longer than half of them. Your analysis is always spot on. Why does he keep—" "I don't know," Charlotte interrupted, though they both knew she'd thought about little else for months. She'd replayed every interaction, scrutinized every email, wondered if she was imagining the systematic erosion of her professional standing. But the data didn't lie, even when everything else did. Back at her cubicle, a cramped space tucked between the supply closet and the printer that seemed to jam whenever she needed it most, Charlotte opened her laptop and stared at the presentation she'd never been allowed to finish. The numbers glowed back at her, stark and unforgiving. VelocityPay's user acquisition costs had increased by 340% over the past quarter. Their customer lifetime value projections didn't match their retention data. Their revenue per user figures that David cited in investor calls seemed to exist in a parallel universe from the ones in her financial models. She'd been hired 18 months ago to bring analytical rigor to VelocityPay's rapid expansion. Her Stanford MBA and her previous experience at a financial consulting firm had seemed like perfect qualifications for a company that prided itself on data-driven decision-making. For the first year, she'd thrived. Her insights had helped optimize their pricing strategy and identify market opportunities that contributed to their early success. Then something had changed. Or maybe she'd just started asking the wrong questions. Her phone buzzed with a text from her father. "Saw VelocityPay in the news again. So proud of you, sweetheart. By the way, I decided to increase my investment. This company is going places." Charlotte's blood ran cold. She speed-dialed his number, her hands shaking as she waited for him to pick up. "Charlotte? Perfect timing. I was just telling your mother about—" "Dad, what do you mean you increased your investment?" she interrupted, her voice sharper than she'd intended. "Well, you've been so excited about the company's potential," Robert Schmidt said, his voice carrying the warm pride that had sustained her through childhood. "And with the latest round of funding making headlines, I figured it was time to go all in. I put the house up as collateral for a business loan. We're talking about real money now, enough to secure your mother's retirement and maybe help you with a down payment when you're ready." The words hit Charlotte like a physical blow. Her father, practical, cautious Robert Schmidt, who'd built his small manufacturing business through decades of steady, honest work, had mortgaged everything based on her casual mentions of VelocityPay's potential. Potential she was increasingly convinced might be built on quicksand. "Dad, how much are we talking about?" "200,000. Nearly everything we have, but Charlotte, this is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. You're on the inside. You see the real numbers." She closed her eyes, fighting back nausea. "I have to go. We'll talk soon, okay?" "Of course, sweetheart. Love you." "Love you too, Dad." Charlotte set her phone down with trembling hands and stared at her screen. The quarterly report beckoned, its implications more terrifying now that her father's life savings hung in the balance. She needed to understand what was happening at VelocityPay, not just for her own sanity, but for Robert Schmidt and the thousands of other investors who trusted the company with their futures. It was nearly midnight when she finally accessed the shared server to upload her incomplete presentation. The office was empty except for the security guard making his rounds and the distant hum of servers processing transactions that, according to her analysis, didn't quite add up. As she navigated through the folder structure, something caught her eye, a directory she'd never noticed before, labeled with a cryptic alphanumeric code. Her cursor hovered over the folder. Opening it would be a violation of protocol, maybe even grounds for termination. But the same analytical instincts that had flagged the acquisition cost discrepancies now screamed that something was fundamentally wrong at VelocityPay. Charlotte double-clicked the folder. Inside were dozens of encrypted files with names that meant nothing to her until she saw one labeled Q3_reconciliation_confidential. Her heart pounded as she downloaded the file to her personal drive. Whatever was in that folder, whatever David Thornfield was so determined to keep hidden behind muted microphones and redirected conversations, she was going to find out. Her father's future and her own integrity depended on it. The office lights dimmed automatically as she gathered her things, casting long shadows across the rows of empty desks. Charlotte walked toward the elevator, her laptop bag heavy with more than just equipment. For the first time in months, she felt something other than helpless frustration. It wasn't quite hope, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might eventually become courage. The encrypted file haunted Charlotte's weekend. She'd tried to open it 17 times, each attempt met with a password prompt that mocked her growing desperation. By Sunday evening, her coffee table was littered with printed VelocityPay documents, public SEC filings, and pages of her own handwritten calculations that painted an increasingly disturbing picture. The user numbers didn't match. VelocityPay claimed 3 million active users in their latest press release, but the payment processor data Charlotte had access to showed transaction volumes consistent with roughly 800,000 users. She'd cross-referenced the discrepancy 3 different ways, hoping to find an explanation that didn't make her stomach turn. Maybe enterprise clients processed payments differently. Maybe there was a lag in reporting. Maybe she was missing something fundamental about fintech infrastructure. But Charlotte Schmidt hadn't graduated summa cum laude from Stanford by ignoring inconvenient data. Monday morning brought David's manic energy to new heights during the all-hands meeting. He paced the stage like a tech evangelist, his voice rising and falling with practiced enthusiasm as he painted visions of revolutionary growth and paradigm-shifting disruption. Charlotte watched from the back of the crowded auditorium, noting how his hands trembled slightly when he cited the user growth numbers she knew were impossible. "We're not just building a payment platform," David declared, his arms spread wide. "We're democratizing financial freedom. Every new user represents someone breaking free from traditional banking's stranglehold on their economic destiny." The crowd erupted in applause. Charlotte felt sick. After the meeting, she lingered in the kitchen area, pretending to make tea while eavesdropping on conversations. Marcus joined her, his usual post-meeting glow dampened by something she couldn't identify. "Great presentation," she offered carefully. "I guess." Marcus stirred his coffee with unnecessary vigor. "Sometimes I wonder if we're moving too fast, you know. David keeps asking me to implement features that don't quite make sense from a technical standpoint." "What kind of features?" Marcus glanced around nervously. "Just reporting modifications. Ways to present user data differently. He says it's for investor transparency, but..." He shrugged, his discomfort palpable. "Maybe I'm overthinking it." Charlotte's pulse quickened. "Have you mentioned your concerns to anyone?" "I tried bringing it up with Jessica last week. She just said David knows what he's doing, and that questioning leadership isn't a good look for someone in their first year." Marcus's voice dropped. "Sometimes I feel like I'm the only one who thinks we should slow down and make sure our foundation is solid before we scale." Before Charlotte could respond, David's voice boomed across the kitchen. "There's my favorite analyst." "Charlotte, I've been meaning to catch up with you." She turned, forcing a smile as David approached with his characteristic blend of charm and menace. Up close, she noticed the dark circles under his eyes and the slight tremor in his left hand. "How's that quarterly report coming along?" he asked, his tone light, but his eyes sharp. "I know you mentioned some concerns about acquisition costs, but I want to make sure we're all on the same page before you finalize anything." "Of course," Charlotte replied carefully. "I'm still reviewing the data to ensure accuracy." "Excellent. You know, Charlotte, accuracy is so important in our line of work. Misinterpretations can cause unnecessary panic among investors. I'd hate for a minor analytical oversight to undermine all the incredible progress we've made." The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Charlotte nodded, her mouth suddenly dry. "I'm glad we understand each other," David continued. "By the way, I couldn't help but overhear Marcus mentioning some technical questions. Marcus, why don't we schedule some time this afternoon to align on priorities? I want to make sure you have all the context you need to feel confident about our direction." Marcus nodded eagerly, missing the warning signs that Charlotte recognized all too well. David was about to neutralize another potential problem. That evening, Charlotte worked late again, ostensibly finishing the quarterly report but actually diving deeper into the financial discrepancies that kept multiplying like cancer cells. She'd discovered that VelocityPay's revenue projections relied heavily on enterprise partnerships, that existed only in PowerPoint presentations. The shell companies that supposedly generated bulk transaction fees had addresses that led to empty office buildings and answering services. Around 10 p.m., she heard voices in David's office. His door was slightly ajar, unusual for his typically secretive phone calls. Charlotte crept closer, her heart hammering as she caught fragments of heated conversation. "Need to move the money faster." David's voice was strained, desperate. Quote, ... "Next funding round has to close by December or we're fucked. Told you the offshore accounts were risky." The other voice was unfamiliar, tinged with an accent Charlotte couldn't place. "Don't lecture me about risk. You think I don't know what's at stake? Just transfer another $2 million from the Cayman Fund and buy us some time." Charlotte backed away slowly, her mind reeling. Offshore accounts. Cayman funds. David wasn't just fabricating user numbers. He was actively moving money around in ways that suggested something far worse than creative accounting. The next morning brought an unexpected encounter with Jessica Park in the elevator. VelocityPay's head of marketing looked impeccable as always, but there was something brittle in her smile. "Charlotte, how are you settling in?" Jessica asked, though Charlotte had been at the company for 18 months. "Fine, thank you. Busy with the quarterly analysis." Jessica's smile faltered slightly. "Right. The analysis. You know, Charlotte, I hope you're being thoughtful about how you present your findings. David has been under tremendous pressure lately with the board and investors. We all need to be team players." "Of course," Charlotte replied carefully. "I just want to make sure the numbers are accurate." "Accuracy is important," Jessica agreed, her voice taking on a strange edge. "But so is loyalty. Sometimes the most accurate thing you can do is trust that leadership has a bigger picture you might not see. Not everything that looks concerning at the granular level is actually problematic." The elevator doors opened at Charlotte's floor, but Jessica's hand shot out to hold them. "Just be careful about digging too deep, Charlotte. Some holes are better left unfilled." As Charlotte walked to her desk, Jessica's warning echoed in her mind alongside the fragments of David's late-night phone call. She was no longer dealing with workplace harassment or even basic fraud. Whatever was happening at VelocityPay was sophisticated, international, and dangerous enough to make even David's enablers nervous. She opened her laptop and stared at the encrypted file icon that had been taunting her for days. Tonight, she decided, she was going to find a way inside that folder. Her father's life savings depended on it. But more than that, the growing realization that thousands of investors and employees were being systematically defrauded demanded action. Charlotte Schmidt had always been methodical, careful, analytical. But as she watched David hold court in the conference room visible from her cubicle, his lies flowing as smoothly as ever, she felt something harder crystallizing in her chest. The same instinct that had driven her to excellence in school and work was now pointing her toward something far more dangerous: the truth. Charlotte Schmidt had always been methodical, careful, analytical. But as she watched David hold court in the conference room visible from her cubicle, his lies flowing as smoothly as ever, she felt something harder crystallizing in her chest. The same instinct that had driven her to excellence in school and work was now pointing her toward something far more dangerous: the truth. The VelocityPay holiday party buzzed with forced enthusiasm around her. Colleagues who barely acknowledged her existence during normal business hours suddenly wanted to chat about year-end bonuses and vacation plans. Charlotte nursed a glass of wine she hadn't touched, watching David work the room like a politician, his charm offensive in full swing as he regaled investors with stories of exponential growth and, quote, revolutionary disruption. She'd spent 3 sleepless nights trying to crack the encrypted files, downloading password-cracking software that made her feel like a criminal. Nothing worked. But tonight presented an opportunity she couldn't ignore. David's laptop sat unattended on the bar, its screensaver glowing softly while he held court 20 feet away. Charlotte's hands trembled as she approached the bar, pretending to refill her wine. A quick glance confirmed David was deep in conversation with a group of venture capitalists, his back turned to her. She had maybe 2 minutes before someone noticed. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, muscle memory guiding her through the file system she'd memorized from her own laptop. The encrypted folder appeared, but this time, instead of a password prompt, she found something that made her blood freeze. David's files were open, unprotected, laid bare in their horrifying clarity. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Q3_reconciliation_confidential contained a spreadsheet that revealed the architecture of a sophisticated Ponzi scheme. New investor funds weren't funding innovation or user acquisition. They were being used to pay returns to earlier investors, creating the illusion of profitability that drove VelocityPay's meteoric valuation. The real user numbers she'd suspected were confirmed. 847,000 actual users, not the 3 million claimed in public filings. But it was worse than simple inflation of metrics. Charlotte discovered shell companies with names like Pacific Financial Solutions and Nordic Tech Holdings that existed solely to launder money through fake enterprise partnerships. Millions of dollars were flowing through offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands, Jersey, and Singapore, creating a paper trail so complex it would take forensic accountants months to unravel. Her stomach lurched as she opened another file labeled Executive_Insurance. David had taken out multi-million-dollar life insurance policies on key employees, including herself. The beneficiary wasn't their families or the company. It was a shell corporation registered in Delaware. Charlotte quickly copied the files to her personal cloud storage, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain someone would hear it over the party's din. As she closed the laptop and stepped away from the bar, David's laughter rang out across the room, sharp and brittle. "Charlotte, there's my favorite number cruncher." She turned to find David approaching with a group of well-dressed investors, his smile predatory in its intensity. "Gentlemen, I want you to meet Charlotte Schmidt, our senior financial analyst." "Charlotte, these are the brilliant minds behind our Series C funding round." The investors smiled politely, but Charlotte could barely process their names through the roar of adrenaline in her ears. She knew now that these men's money was being stolen, funneled through the labyrinthine scheme she'd just uncovered. "Charlotte was just telling me how excited she is about our Q4 projections," David continued, his eyes boring into hers. "Weren't you, Charlotte?" "Yes," she managed, her voice sounding foreign to her own ears. "Very exciting numbers." "I'm sure they are," one investor said. "David mentioned you have some innovative approaches to user acquisition cost analysis." Charlotte nearly choked. She'd never presented any analysis to David. He'd systematically prevented her from doing so for months. But here he was, claiming credit for work that had never been allowed to see the light of day, while simultaneously using her presence to legitimize his fraud. "Our acquisition strategies are quite unique," she said carefully, the weight of her knowledge pressing down on her like a physical force. 20 minutes later, Charlotte escaped to the bathroom, locking herself in a stall as her hands shook uncontrollably. She pulled out her phone and dialed her father's number before she could lose her nerve. "Charlotte, how's the party?" "Dad, I need to ask you something important. Your investment in VelocityPay, is there any way to get it back? Any cooling off period or, sweetheart, what's wrong? You sound upset." Charlotte closed her eyes, tears threatening to spill over. How could she explain that her father's life savings had been fed into a criminal enterprise? That she'd unknowingly been the face that gave Robert Schmidt confidence to mortgage everything? I'm concerned about some market volatility. Maybe it would be wise to diversify." "Charlotte, you're scaring me. Has something happened at work?" Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Enjoying the party? We should talk soon. A friend." The blood drained from her face. Someone knew she'd accessed David's laptop. "Dad, I have to go. Can we talk tomorrow?" "Of course, but Charlotte—" She hung up, staring at the text message. The timing couldn't be coincidental. Someone had been watching her, possibly recording her illegal access to David's files. Her mind raced through possibilities. David himself building a case for her termination. A private investigator. someone else in the company who knew about the fraud. Charlotte returned to the party on unsteady legs, hyper-aware of every glance and conversation. Marcus found her near the windows, his usual easy smile replaced by concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he said quietly. "Marcus, I need to ask you something, and I need you to be completely honest with me. Those database modifications David's been requesting, do they involve customer account data?" Marcus glanced around nervously. "I probably shouldn't discuss." "Please, this is important." "Some of them, yeah. He wanted me to create duplicate account entries with different transaction histories. Said it was for backup purposes, but—" Marcus lowered his voice. "Charlotte, I think those accounts might be fake. The transaction patterns don't match real user behavior." The final piece clicked into place. Marcus, innocent, idealistic Marcus, had been unknowingly helping to create the phantom users that inflated VelocityPay's metrics. He was as much a victim as the investors, manipulated into complicity by his trust in leadership. "Marcus, whatever David asks you to do next, I need you to document it. Keep records of every request, every modification. Can you do that?" "Why, Charlotte, you're freaking me out." Before she could answer, David's voice cut through the party noise. "Attention, everyone. I want to thank you all for making VelocityPay the success story it is today." Charlotte watched him raise his glass, his face flushed with wine and the intoxication of his own lies. Around him, employees and investors applauded, celebrating a company that existed only in PowerPoint presentations and fabricated spreadsheets. "To revolutionary growth," David proclaimed. "To revolutionary growth," the crowd echoed. Charlotte didn't raise her glass. Instead, she pulled out her phone and navigated to the FBI's financial crimes tip line. Her finger hovered over the call button as David's speech continued in the background, each word another layer of fraud being painted over the truth. Her father's voice echoed in her memory. "You're on the inside. You see the real numbers." She did see the real numbers now, and they were going to destroy everything. Charlotte pressed the call button, then immediately hung up as panic seized her. She wasn't ready. She needed more evidence, more protection, more certainty that she could survive what came next. But as she looked around the party, at Marcus's innocent face, at the investors whose trust was being systematically betrayed, at her colleagues who would lose their jobs when the truth emerged, she realized that readiness was a luxury she couldn't afford. The phone felt heavy in her hand as David's laughter rang out across the room, sharp with the desperation of a man whose empire was built on quicksand. Tomorrow, Charlotte decided, she would make the call that would change everything. The phone felt heavy in her hand as David's laughter rang out across the room, sharp with the desperation of a man whose empire was built on quicksand. Tomorrow, Charlotte decided, she would make the call that would change everything. The morning after the holiday party arrived, gray and suffocating, San Francisco fog pressing against VelocityPay's floor-to-ceiling windows, like a physical manifestation of Charlotte's dread. She'd barely slept, her mind cycling through the horrifying revelations from David's laptop and the mysterious text that suggested someone knew about her investigation. She needed allies, but in an office where David's paranoia was becoming infectious, trust felt like a luxury she couldn't afford. Still, there were two people who might be worth the risk. Elena Vasquez, the general counsel whose discomfort had become increasingly obvious, and Marcus, whose technical innocence made him both vulnerable and valuable. Charlotte found Elena in the break room at 7:30 a.m., nursing coffee with the hollow-eyed determination of someone who'd also spent the night wrestling with demons. "Early morning?" Charlotte ventured, pouring herself tea she didn't want. "Couldn't sleep," Elena replied, her usual professional composure cracked around the edges. "You?" "Same." Charlotte chose her next words carefully. "Elena, can I ask you something hypothetical? If someone discovered irregularities in a company's financial structure, what would be the proper legal channels to address that?" Elena's coffee cup froze halfway to her lips. For a long moment, the only sound was the distant hum of the espresso machine and the muffled conversations of early arriving employees. "Hypothetically," Elena said slowly, "it would depend on the nature of the irregularities. Minor accounting issues might be handled internally. But if someone had reason to believe they'd uncovered securities fraud or more serious financial crimes, she set down her cup with deliberate precision. That person would have certain legal obligations and protections, theoretically. The careful emphasis on theoretically sent a chill down Charlotte's spine. Elena knew. Maybe not the full scope, but she knew something was wrong. "How long have you known?" Charlotte whispered. Elena glanced around the empty break room, then pulled Charlotte into the adjacent supply closet, closing the door behind them. In the cramped space between shelves of printer paper and cleaning supplies, Elena's professional mask finally crumbled. 4 months, she whispered. Maybe longer. David asked me to review some investor agreements that made no sense from a legal standpoint. Shell companies registered in jurisdictions that specialize in financial opacity. Account structures that look designed to obscure rather than clarify money flows. Why didn't you report it? Elena's laugh was bitter. I tried. I went to David with my concerns, thinking maybe I was misunderstanding something. He made it very clear that my student loan debt made me vulnerable, that questions about my competence could derail my career permanently, that he had connections who could ensure I never worked in corporate law again. Charlotte felt sick. David's manipulation wasn't limited to silencing her in meetings. He was systematically identifying and exploiting everyone's vulnerabilities. Elena, I think it's worse than you know. I've seen evidence of a full Ponzi scheme. Fake user accounts, offshore money laundering, fabricated revenue streams, and… She hesitated, then decided Elena needed to know everything. Life insurance policies on employees with shell companies as beneficiaries. The color drained from Elena's face. Jesus Christ. Charlotte, if you're right, we're not just talking about securities fraud. This is organized financial crime. RICO territory. I need documentation. Legal proof that will hold up under federal scrutiny. I have some files, Elena said quietly. Agreements I was asked to draft that I knew were legally questionable. I kept copies as insurance, in case David tried to make me the scapegoat. They're hidden in my personal cloud storage. Can you get them to me? Not here, too risky. But Charlotte, if we're going to do this, we need to be smart. David's not just a fraudster, he's paranoid and getting more desperate. People like that become dangerous when they feel cornered. They exchanged secure email addresses and agreed to meet that evening at a coffee shop in the Mission District, far from VelocityPay's usual haunts. As they prepared to leave the supply closet, Elena grabbed Charlotte's arm. Be careful who else you trust. Jessica Park isn't as innocent as she pretends. She's been David's gatekeeper for information flow for months. And watch yourself around the new security measures. David had cameras installed in areas that didn't have them before. Charlotte spent the rest of the morning hyper-aware of every surveillance camera, every casual conversation that might be more than it seemed. Her paranoia spiked when she noticed a man in a generic business suit lingering near the elevators, his attention seeming to follow her movements. Around lunch, Marcus appeared at her cubicle, with his usual nervous energy amplified to an almost manic level. Charlotte, I need to show you something, he said quietly. But not here. Can we take a walk? They left VelocityPay's gleaming lobby and walked toward the waterfront, Marcus checking over his shoulder with the jittery awareness of someone who'd learned that walls had ears. David asked me to do something yesterday that I can't get out of my head, Marcus said once they were safely away from the building. He wanted me to create a batch processing script that would automatically generate user accounts with transaction histories. Thousands of them. Said it was for stress testing our systems. Charlotte's stomach dropped. Did you do it? I started to, but then I realized what he was really asking for. These weren't test accounts. They were designed to look like real users, with real transaction patterns, complete with fake demographic data, spending habits, everything. Charlotte, I think I've been helping him create phantom customers. Marcus, this is important. Do you have records of these requests? Screenshots, emails? Anything that proves David asked you to create fake accounts? Some emails, yeah. I saved them because something felt off. But Charlotte, there's more. I dug into our user database last night, and I found hundreds of accounts that match the patterns David's been asking me to create. Accounts that were supposedly created months ago, but with metadata that shows they were actually generated by automated scripts. The pieces were falling into place with terrifying clarity. David hadn't just asked Marcus to create tools for fraud. He'd been systematically building an infrastructure of deception for months, possibly years. I don't know what to do, Marcus continued, his voice cracking with the weight of unwitting complicity. If this gets out, I could be charged as an accomplice. But if I stay quiet— You're not an accomplice, Charlotte said firmly. You're a victim of manipulation. But Marcus, I need you to do something for me. Document everything. Every request David makes. Every modification he asks for. Every conversation about these systems. Can you do that without arousing suspicion? I think so. But Charlotte, what's really going on? How bad is this? Before she could answer, her phone buzzed with a text from the same unknown number as the night before. Interesting lunch conversation. You might want to be more careful about where you discuss sensitive topics. A friend. Charlotte showed Marcus the message, watching his face go pale as the implications sank in. Someone's following us, she whispered. Someone knows we're investigating. They walked back to VelocityPay in tense silence, both hyper-aware of every pedestrian, every car, every face that might be paying too much attention. Back in the office, Charlotte made a decision that terrified and exhilarated her in equal measure. Ms. Schmidt, this is Special Agent Sarah Rodriguez with the FBI's Financial Crimes Division. I received your email and I'd like to discuss your concerns. Are you available to meet tomorrow evening? The Blue Bottle Coffee on Market Street hummed with the usual evening crowd of freelancers and students, laptops glowing against the industrial decor. Charlotte had chosen a corner table where she could watch both entrances, her back to the wall, a precaution that would have seemed paranoid a week ago, but now felt like basic survival instinct. Agent Sarah Rodriguez was nothing like Charlotte had expected. Instead of the stern federal agent stereotype, she appeared to be in her early 40s with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and graying hair pulled into a practical ponytail. She moved through the coffee shop with quiet confidence, scanning the room with professional awareness before settling across from Charlotte. Thank you for reaching out, Rodriguez said, her voice carrying a slight accent that suggested West Coast origins. Before we begin, I want you to understand that this conversation is preliminary. Nothing you tell me tonight legally binds you to any course of action, and I'm here to listen, not to pressure you into anything. Charlotte had rehearsed this moment dozens of times, but sitting across from an actual FBI agent made her carefully planned words evaporate. I'm not sure where to start. Start wherever feels comfortable. Your email mentioned systematic securities fraud and a Ponzi scheme. Those are serious allegations. Taking a shaky breath, Charlotte began with the muted microphones, the patterns of silencing that had first made her question David's motives. Rodriguez listened without interruption, occasionally making notes in a small leather notebook. When Charlotte described accessing David's laptop at the holiday party, Rodriguez's expression grew more serious. You downloaded confidential files from your CEO's personal computer without authorization, Rodriguez said carefully. That presents some legal complications for both your safety and any potential prosecution. I know it was illegal, Charlotte admitted, but I had to know the truth. My father has his life savings invested in this company. Rodriguez leaned forward slightly. Tell me about the files. Charlotte pulled out her laptop and opened the document she'd copied, sliding the screen toward Rodriguez. The agent's expression grew increasingly grim as she scrolled through the evidence. Shell companies, offshore accounts, fabricated user data, and the complex architecture of financial deception that David had constructed. This is comprehensive, Rodriguez said finally. Ms. Schmidt, what you've uncovered here appears to be a sophisticated wire fraud and money laundering operation. The scale suggests this isn't amateur hour. Whoever designed this scheme has serious experience with financial crime. David Thornfield, the CEO. He used to work at Goldman Sachs before starting VelocityPay. Was he terminated from Goldman for cause? Quietly fired for ethical violations, according to someone who worked there. But I don't have proof of that. Rodriguez made more notes. What about other employees? Are they complicit or victims? Charlotte described Elena's situation, threatened into silence despite knowing about legal irregularities, and Marcus's unwitting role in creating the technical infrastructure for fake user accounts. She explained how David systematically identified and exploited personal vulnerabilities: Elena's student debt, Marcus's career ambitions, her own history of workplace retaliation. Classic manipulation tactics, Rodriguez observed. Create complicity through fear and dependency, then use that complicity as insurance against whistleblowing. How many employees would you estimate know about the fraud? Maybe 5 or 6 people know pieces of it. Elena and I probably have the most complete picture, but David's been very careful to compartmentalize information. Rodriguez closed her notebook and studied Charlotte carefully. Ms. Schmidt, I need to be direct with you about what we're discussing here. If VelocityPay is operating the way you've described, we're looking at potential federal charges for wire fraud, money laundering, securities fraud, and possibly RICO violations. A case this complex could take months or years to build properly. What does that mean for me? It means that if you decide to cooperate with a federal investigation, you'd be committing to a long, difficult process. Thornfield clearly suspects someone is investigating. The surveillance you've described suggests he's already taking countermeasures. Informants in cases like this face real, personal, and professional risks. Charlotte felt her carefully maintained composure beginning to crack. What kind of risks? Retaliation, character assassination, legal challenges to your credibility. Men like Thornfield don't go down quietly. They have resources and connections, and they're not above using intimidation tactics. Rodriguez's voice softened. I've seen whistleblowers lose their careers, their reputations, sometimes their families. The law provides protections, but those protections aren't perfect. And if I don't cooperate, the fraud continues. More investors lose their money. More employees get implicated as unwitting accomplices. And eventually, when schemes like this collapse, and they always collapse, the damage is exponentially worse. Charlotte thought of her father's pride when he'd invested his life savings, of Marcus's earnest belief in VelocityPay's mission, of the investors she'd met at the holiday party who had no idea their money was funding an elaborate lie. What would cooperation look like? Rodriguez reopened her notebook. Initially, we'd need you to continue your normal work routine while documenting additional evidence. We'd provide you with secure communication tools and recording devices. Eventually, we might ask you to participate in controlled conversations with Thornfield or other suspects. Wearing a wire? Possibly. But we'd never put you in a situation without extensive preparation and backup protocols. Rodriguez paused. Ms. Schmidt, I should mention that we've been monitoring VelocityPay peripherally for several months. Suspicious money transfers flagged our attention, but we haven't had probable cause for a full investigation. An inside source would change that significantly. Charlotte's mind raced. The FBI had already been watching VelocityPay, which meant the evidence was even stronger than she'd realized. But it also meant David's paranoia might be justified. Law enforcement was already circling. There's something else, she said. David announced a major investor meeting next week. He seemed desperate about it, like everything depended on closing this next funding round. Rodriguez's expression sharpened. That could be the endgame. In Ponzi schemes, there's usually a final push to bring in enough new money to allow the architects to disappear before the collapse. If Thornfield is planning an exit strategy, we might have a narrow window to act. The weight of the decision pressed down on Charlotte like a physical force. Everything in her careful, analytical nature screamed that cooperating with the FBI was the logical choice. But the thought of deceiving colleagues, of recording conversations, of potentially destroying the lives of innocent employees made her stomach churn. I need to think about this, she said finally. Of course. But Ms. Schmidt, I need you to understand something. Rodriguez's voice took on an urgent edge. If Thornfield suspects you're investigating, your window for safe cooperation may be closing. Men facing federal charges for financial crimes sometimes become unpredictable. Rodriguez handed Charlotte a business card with a handwritten number on the back. My direct line. If you decide to move forward, or if you feel you're in immediate danger, call me immediately, day or night. As they prepared to leave, Rodriguez caught Charlotte's arm gently. For what it's worth, you've already shown tremendous courage. Not many people would risk their careers to protect strangers' money. Whatever you decide, make sure it's something you can live with. Walking back to her car, Charlotte felt the weight of Rodriguez's words settling around her like a shroud. The FBI agent was right. She'd already crossed a line by accessing David's files, by gathering evidence, by sitting in that coffee shop. The question now wasn't whether to act, but how far she was willing to go. Her phone buzzed with another text from the unknown number. Interesting coffee date. Hope it was productive. A friend. Charlotte's blood ran cold. Someone had been watching her meeting with Rodriguez. David's surveillance network was more sophisticated than she'd imagined, and her cover was already blown. She had until morning to make a decision that would define the rest of her life. Charlotte barely slept. By 5 a.m., she was sitting at her kitchen table with Agent Rodriguez's business card, her laptop open to the evidence files that could destroy VelocityPay, and everyone in it. The text messages from her mysterious watcher proved that staying silent was no longer an option. David knew she was investigating, which meant her safety depended on having federal protection. She dialed Rodriguez's direct line. Agent Rodriguez, this is Charlotte Schmidt. I've made my decision. 2 hours later, Charlotte sat in the FBI's San Francisco field office, signing forms that made her cooperation official. Rodriguez had explained the recording equipment, a device smaller than a flash drive that would capture conversations within a 20-foot radius. The irony wasn't lost on her. After months of being silenced by David's muted microphones, she was about to become the one doing the recording. Remember, Rodriguez said, fitting the nearly invisible recording device into the lining of Charlotte's jacket. Your goal isn't to entrap anyone. Just document normal business conversations. If Thornfield starts discussing anything related to the fraud, let him talk. Don't push, don't ask leading questions. We need evidence that will hold up in court. Charlotte's first day as an FBI informant began with VelocityPay's investor presentation. The meeting David had described as make or break for the company's future. The conference room buzzed with nervous energy, as employees prepared materials that Charlotte now knew were elaborate fiction. David stood at the head of the table, his usual charisma amplified by what Charlotte recognized as desperation. Ladies and gentlemen, today we make history. These investors represent our pathway to true market domination. Charlotte activated her recording device as David launched into his presentation, each fabricated metric and inflated projection now carrying the weight of federal evidence. She watched the investors, seasoned venture capitalists who should have been asking harder questions, not approvingly at numbers she knew were impossible. Our user growth trajectory shows 340% quarter-over-quarter expansion, David declared, clicking to a slide Charlotte had helped prepare months ago. Back then, she'd questioned the data. Now she knew it represented phantom accounts Marcus had unknowingly created. During the break, Charlotte approached Elena near the coffee station. Their conversation looked casual, but Charlotte's heart hammered as she spoke the words Rodriguez had coached her to use. The numbers David presented, they seem aggressive even for our growth trajectory. Elena's response was carefully neutral, but her eyes conveyed volumes. David's always been optimistic about our metrics. Sometimes I wonder if his enthusiasm outpaces our actual capabilities. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was Elena acknowledging awareness of potential problems while maintaining plausible deniability. Charlotte realized that Elena, despite being her ally, was also protecting herself legally. The afternoon brought a development that made Charlotte's blood run cold. David announced that he'd hired security consultants to address concerns about corporate espionage. A man in an expensive suit introduced himself as Jake Morrison from Sentinel Risk Management, essentially a private investigation firm. We'll be conducting interviews with all staff members to ensure information security protocols are being followed, Morrison explained. His eyes lingered on Charlotte with uncomfortable intensity. We're particularly interested in any unusual computer access or file-sharing activities. Charlotte's hands trembled slightly as she pretended to take notes. Morrison wasn't just conducting interviews. He was hunting for the source of the leaks that David suspected were happening. Later that evening, Charlotte met with Marcus in a Mission District bar, far from VelocityPay's surveillance network. The recording device felt heavy in her jacket, as Marcus confided his growing fears. "They're asking me to modify the user database again," Marcus said, his voice barely audible over the ambient noise. "This time, they want me to create accounts that can generate automated transactions. Charlotte, I think they're planning to fake trading activity to inflate our revenue numbers." "Have you done it yet?" "I started, but something feels wrong, really wrong. I saved screenshots of the requirements David sent me, but I'm scared to refuse outright. What if they fire me? What if they—" Marcus trailed off, his eyes wide with fear he couldn't articulate. Charlotte felt sick. Marcus was being pressured to create the technical infrastructure for an even more sophisticated fraud, and his moral compass was fighting against explicit instructions from leadership. She needed to protect him without blowing her cover. "Marcus, whatever you do, document everything. Every request, every conversation, every modification they ask for. And maybe slow down the implementation. Ask clarifying questions. Request additional specifications. Buy yourself time to think through the implications. You think I should stall?" Charlotte met his eyes, hoping he could read the message she couldn't speak aloud. "I think you should be very, very careful about implementing anything that doesn't feel right." The next morning brought Charlotte's interview with Morrison. She sat across from him in a VelocityPay conference room, hyper-aware of the recording device in her jacket and the way his questions probed for any signs of unusual behavior. "Your computer logs show you've been working very late hours recently," Morrison said, consulting a folder thick with printed reports. "Can you explain why you've been accessing the financial servers outside normal business hours?" "Quarterly analysis requires extensive data review," Charlotte replied carefully. "I prefer working when the office is quiet and I can focus without interruptions." "And you haven't shared any confidential information with outside parties? No discussions about company finances with family members, friends, former colleagues?" The question was a trap. Morrison probably knew about her father's investment, might even know about her meeting with Rodriguez. Charlotte chose her words carefully. "My father is an investor in the company, so naturally I've mentioned VelocityPay's general success in family conversations, but I've never shared specific confidential information." Morrison made notes that seemed ominous in their detail. "What about your relationship with Elena Vasquez and Marcus Williams? You've been observed having frequent private conversations with both of them." "Elena and Marcus are colleagues. We discuss work-related matters and general office concerns. Nothing inappropriate." "Define, quote, general office concerns." Charlotte's pulse quickened. Morrison was fishing for evidence of conspiracy, trying to determine if she was coordinating with other employees to undermine David's authority. "Normal workplace issues, project deadlines, system updates, process improvements. The kind of conversations that happen in any office environment." After an hour of similar questions, Morrison dismissed her with a smile that never reached his eyes. "Thank you for your cooperation, Ms. Schmidt. We'll be in touch if we need additional information." Walking back to her desk, Charlotte realized that David's paranoia had evolved into a systematic counterintelligence operation. Morrison wasn't just investigating leaks. He was building a case to identify and neutralize anyone who posed a threat to VelocityPay's continued operation. That evening, Charlotte received an encrypted message from Rodriguez. "Interview findings suggest immediate escalation necessary. Need you to attend tomorrow's board meeting with full recording capability. This may be our last opportunity before they identify you as the source." Charlotte stared at the message, her hands shaking. The FBI was accelerating the timeline, which meant her window for safe operation was closing rapidly. Tomorrow's board meeting would either provide the evidence needed to bring down David's empire, or it would expose her as a federal informant. She was walking a tightrope over an abyss, and the rope was beginning to fray. In 12 hours, Charlotte would enter VelocityPay's boardroom, knowing it might be the last time she did so as anything other than a target. The emergency all-hands meeting was called for 8 a.m. sharp, an unusual time that sent ripples of anxiety through VelocityPay's normally caffeine-dependent workforce. Charlotte arrived early, her recording device activated and her nerves stretched thin as piano wire. The auditorium filled with confused employees, clutching coffee cups and exchanging worried glances. David took the stage with an energy that seemed both manic and controlled, his usual charisma edged with something darker. Charlotte recognized the signs now. The slight tremor in his hands, the way his eyes darted around the room, the forced precision of his movements. This was a man barely containing his paranoia. "Thank you all for adjusting your schedules," David began, his voice carrying across the silent auditorium. "I've called this meeting to address a serious threat to our company's future. It has come to my attention that someone within VelocityPay has been engaging in corporate espionage." A collective intake of breath rippled through the crowd. Charlotte forced herself to maintain a neutral expression while her heart hammered against her ribs. "Confidential financial information has been leaked to outside parties," David continued, his gaze sweeping the room with predatory intensity. "Proprietary data that took years to develop has been compromised. This isn't just theft. It's an attack on every person in this room who has worked to build something revolutionary." Charlotte felt eyes turning toward her, subtle glances from colleagues who might have noticed her late-night work sessions or tense conversations with Elena and Marcus. Paranoia was becoming contagious, and David was deliberately fostering it. "Effective immediately, we're implementing enhanced security protocols," David announced. "All computer access will be monitored in real time. Personal devices are prohibited in work areas. And anyone found violating information security policies will face immediate termination and criminal prosecution." The threat was clear, and Charlotte realized that David wasn't just announcing new policies. He was sending a message to whoever had been investigating him. He knew someone was watching, and he was preparing for war. After the meeting, Charlotte hurried to her desk, her mind racing. She needed to warn Elena and Marcus about the escalation without triggering the surveillance systems David had obviously expanded. But as she rounded the corner to her cubicle, she found Jake Morrison waiting for her, his presence as ominous as a vulture. "Miss Schmidt, I need you to come with me," Morrison said, his tone leaving no room for negotiation. Charlotte's blood ran cold, but she forced herself to appear calm. "Of course. Is this about the security protocols David mentioned?" Among other things, Morrison led her to a small conference room she'd never seen before, windowless and sterile. As she sat down, Charlotte noticed a manila folder thick, with documents bearing her name. "Your computer logs make for interesting reading," Morrison said, opening the folder with theatrical precision. "Particularly your access patterns from the past month. You've been very busy after hours." Charlotte's mouth went dry, but she maintained her composure. "As I mentioned yesterday, quarterly analysis requires extensive review of financial data. Indeed, but some of your access seems to go beyond normal analytical work." Morrison pulled out a printed report that made Charlotte's stomach lurch. "For instance, this query you ran 3 weeks ago accessed customer account creation timestamps. Why would a financial analyst need to examine when individual user accounts were established?" The question was a trap. Charlotte realized that Morrison had been building a comprehensive case against her, documenting every digital footprint that could suggest unauthorized investigation. "I was trying to understand user acquisition patterns over time," she said carefully, correlating account creation with marketing campaigns to analyze conversion effectiveness. "And this?" Morrison slid another document across the table. "You downloaded files from a restricted directory that contains confidential investor information. Files that were accessed during off hours when building security logs show no record of authorized personnel in the office." Charlotte's heart stopped. Morrison had evidence of her accessing David's laptop during the holiday party. The building's security system had recorded her presence during unauthorized hours, and now they were connecting her digital footprints to physical evidence. Charlotte began, then realized that any explanation would only dig her deeper. "I think I should consult with HR about these allegations." Morrison smiled, and Charlotte felt ice forming in her veins. "HR has been fully briefed on this investigation. In fact, they're the ones who authorized us to examine your personal communications." He pulled out another folder, this one containing printed emails and text messages. Charlotte caught glimpses of her exchanges with Elena, with Marcus. even fragments of her communication with Agent Rodriguez that somehow hadn't been as secure as she'd believed. Your pattern of contact with Elena Vasquez and Marcus Williams suggests coordinated activity, Morrison continued. And these communications with an unidentified federal contact are particularly concerning. The game was over. Morrison had enough evidence to prove Charlotte was the source of the leaks, and possibly enough to implicate Rodriguez as well. Charlotte realized she had minutes, maybe less, before this interrogation became something much worse. "I need to use the restroom," she said, standing abruptly. Morrison's hand moved to block her path. "I'm afraid this conversation isn't finished, Ms. Schmidt. Are you detaining me? Because if so, I think I need to contact an attorney." The standoff lasted 10 seconds that felt like hours. Finally, Morrison stepped aside. "Of course not. But I hope you'll return promptly. We have more to discuss." Charlotte walked to the bathroom on unsteady legs, her mind racing through options that all seemed to lead to disaster. Once inside, she pulled out her phone and sent a desperate text to Rodriguez. "Loan. Morrison has everything. Need extraction now." The response came within seconds. "Stay calm. Building is under surveillance. Exit through loading dock in basement. Black sedan will be waiting on Folsom Street." Charlotte deleted the exchange and returned to the conference room, where Morrison was studying additional documents with the satisfaction of a hunter who had cornered his prey. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, forcing her voice to remain steady. "I'm feeling quite unwell. I think I need to go home." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "Perhaps we should call a doctor. Or maybe discuss your health concerns with David directly. I'm sure he'd be very interested in your symptoms." The threat was unmistakable. Morrison wasn't going to let her leave the building voluntarily. Charlotte realized that her investigation had crossed a line from corporate espionage into something much more dangerous. David wasn't just protecting a fraud, he was protecting a criminal enterprise worth hundreds of millions of dollars, and people had disappeared for much less. "Actually," Charlotte said, sitting back down with forced calm, "I'm feeling better. What else did you want to discuss?" But even as she spoke, her mind was calculating distances and exit routes. Morrison had evidence that could destroy her, but he'd also revealed the scope of David's surveillance network. The FBI knew she was compromised, which meant they were already moving to the next phase of their investigation. Charlotte just had to survive long enough to see it happen. As Morrison opened another folder, Charlotte caught a glimpse of photographs. Surveillance images of her meeting with Rodriguez, her conversations with Elena and Marcus, even pictures of her father's house in Ohio. David Thornfield wasn't just fighting for his company anymore. He was fighting for his freedom, and he was prepared to destroy anyone who threatened it. Morrison's interrogation was interrupted by a knock on the conference room door. David entered without waiting for permission, his presence filling the small space with barely contained menace. Charlotte had never seen him like this. The polished CEO veneer completely stripped away, revealing something predatory underneath. "Thank you, Jake. I'll take it from here," David said, his voice carrying an authority that brooked no argument. Morrison gathered his files and left without a word, leaving Charlotte alone with the man whose empire she'd been systematically documenting for federal prosecutors. David closed the door with deliberate precision and took the seat across from her. "Charlotte," he said, her name rolling off his tongue like a curse. "My brilliant, meticulous financial analyst. Do you know how long I've known?" Charlotte forced herself to meet his gaze, though every instinct screamed at her to run. "Known what?" David laughed, a sound devoid of warmth. 3 weeks. I've known for 3 weeks that you've been building a case against me. The question that's been keeping me awake at night is why." He opened a folder that Morrison had left behind, revealing photographs that made Charlotte's blood freeze. Pictures of her meeting with Rodriguez. Screenshots of her file downloads. Even images of her father's manufacturing plant in Ohio, with her father clearly visible in the foreground. "You see, Charlotte, when someone threatens everything I've built, I take it personally. VelocityPay isn't just a company, it's my life's work. And you've been trying to burn it down." The company is built on fraud, Charlotte said quietly, surprised by the steadiness of her own voice. You're stealing money from investors. From people like my father. Your father. David's smile turned vicious. Robert Schmidt. Such a hardworking man. Mortgaged his house, his business, everything he owns to invest in VelocityPay. Based on your recommendation, I believe. The words hit Charlotte like physical blows. David had deliberately manipulated her father's investment, using her unwitting endorsement as bait. Here's what's going to happen, David continued, his voice taking on the tone of a man accustomed to absolute control. You're going to call your FBI handler. Yes, I know about Agent Rodriguez, and tell her you made a mistake. That you misunderstood some financial documents, and there's no evidence of wrongdoing at VelocityPay. I won't do that. Oh, but you will. Because if you don't, your father's investment disappears entirely. Not just the money he put in. I'll make sure he loses the house, the business, everything. And then I'll destroy your reputation so thoroughly that you'll never work in finance again. Charlotte felt the walls closing in, but something inside her, the same analytical precision that had uncovered David's crimes, refused to bend. You can't make the evidence disappear, David. The FBI has copies of everything. Evidence obtained through illegal computer access by a disgruntled employee with a history of workplace conflicts? Evidence that conveniently appeared after you accessed my personal laptop without authorization? David leaned forward. Charlotte, I'm not some amateur. I've been planning for this possibility since the day you started asking uncomfortable questions. He pulled out another document, a detailed psychological evaluation that made Charlotte's stomach turn. Dr. Patricia Hewson is a respected forensic psychiatrist. She'll testify that you exhibited signs of delusional thinking, workplace paranoia, and a pattern of making false accusations against authority figures. Your previous job termination will support that narrative beautifully. The sophistication of David's counterattack was breathtaking. He'd been building a case to destroy her credibility, even as she'd been gathering evidence against him. But it doesn't have to go that way, David continued, his voice shifting to the persuasive tone that had convinced thousands of investors to trust him with their money. You're brilliant, Charlotte, truly brilliant. Join me instead of fighting me. Help me build something bigger than your narrow moral concerns. Join you? I'm offering you a partnership. Real money, real power. You understand the financial architecture better than anyone. Imagine what we could accomplish together. Forget about your father's small-time manufacturing business. I'm talking about wealth that could set your family up for generations. Charlotte stared at David, recognizing the same manipulation tactics he'd used on Elena, on Marcus, on countless employees and investors. The offer was seductive, and she could see how others had been drawn into complicity. What about Marcus, Elena, the other employees who trusted you? Casualties of business, David said with casual indifference. Marcus is young. He'll find another job. Elena made her choice when she decided to play both sides. As for the others, he shrugged. They'll land on their feet or they won't. Not our concern. The callousness in his voice crystallized Charlotte's resolve. This wasn't just about financial fraud. It was about a man who viewed other people as disposable assets in his personal empire. No, she said quietly. David's expression darkened. I'm sorry? Number, I won't help you steal from my father. I won't help you destroy Marcus's future. And I won't help you turn VelocityPay into a criminal enterprise. You're making a mistake, Charlotte. A very serious mistake. Maybe. But it's my mistake to make. David stood abruptly, his carefully maintained composure finally cracking. You have no idea what you're up against. I have resources you can't imagine. Connections that reach into law enforcement, into regulatory agencies, into the courts themselves. I will destroy you so completely that... The conference room door burst open, interrupting David's threat. Agent Rodriguez entered with 2 other federal agents, their badges displayed prominently. David Thornfield, you're under arrest for wire fraud, money laundering, and securities fraud, Rodriguez announced. her voice carrying the authority of federal law enforcement. David's face went white as the agents read him his rights. Charlotte realized that her recording device had been transmitting everything to the FBI team positioned outside the building. David's threats, his admissions of fraud, his detailed description of the evidence tampering, all of it captured for prosecution. "You set me up," David snarled at Charlotte, as the agents secured his hands behind his back. "No," Charlotte replied, standing on unsteady legs. "You exposed yourself." As the agents led David away, Rodriguez turned to Charlotte with an expression of professional respect, mixed with genuine concern. "Are you all right?" Charlotte nodded, though she felt anything but all right. "What happens now?" "Now we execute search warrants on VelocityPay's offices and servers. We freeze the offshore accounts, and we begin the process of trying to recover as much stolen money as possible for the victims. My father will do everything we can to protect the investors' funds. It won't be everything, but it might be enough to prevent total loss." Charlotte looked around the conference room where her life had just changed forever. David Thornfield was in custody, but the investigation was far from over. There would be trials, testimony, media scrutiny, and the inevitable blame from victims who had lost their life savings. But for the first time in months, Charlotte felt something she'd almost forgotten: the quiet satisfaction of having done the right thing, regardless of the cost. The weight of truth, she realized, was lighter than the burden of silence. 3 months after David Thornfield's arrest, Charlotte sat in Agent Rodriguez's government sedan, watching FBI agents carry boxes of evidence from VelocityPay's offices. The building that had once hummed with the energy of a promising startup now stood hollow, its windows dark except for the occasional flash of camera bulbs, documenting the systematic dismantling of a criminal enterprise. Final count shows approximately $340 million in fraudulent investments, Rodriguez said, consulting a tablet thick with financial data. We've traced funds through 14 shell companies across 8 countries. The recovery process will take years. Charlotte nodded, though the numbers felt abstract after months of living with their human cost. Her father had lost nearly everything: the house, the business, 40 years of careful savings reduced to legal paperwork and promises of eventual partial restitution. Robert Schmidt had taken the news with the quiet dignity that had defined his entire life. But Charlotte saw how it aged him, how his shoulders carried the weight of dreams that would never be recovered. How much will investors get back? Maybe 30 cents on the dollar if we're lucky. Thornfield was sophisticated about moving money offshore. Some of it may never be recoverable. The media attention had been relentless. Charlotte's identity as the whistleblower leaked within days of David's arrest, turning her into a reluctant public figure. The coverage split predictably. Business publications praised her courage, while victim advocacy groups alternately hailed and condemned her for not speaking up sooner. The hardest part was the anger from VelocityPay's employees. Marcus had found new work quickly. His technical skills were marketable. But many of the older employees faced months of unemployment in a competitive market. Jessica Park's career imploded entirely when investigators revealed her role in creating the fraudulent marketing materials. Elena had cooperated fully with authorities and managed to avoid disbarment, but her corporate law career was effectively over. "Any word from Thornfield's legal team?" Charlotte asked. Rodriguez's expression darkened. "They're pushing for a plea deal. 20 years instead of life, cooperation in recovering additional funds, full admission of guilt. The prosecutors are considering it. 20 years feels light for what he did. Maybe, but a plea deal guarantees conviction and might help us recover more money for the victims. Sometimes justice is about practical results rather than perfect punishment." Charlotte's phone buzzed with yet another interview request from a documentary filmmaker. She'd stopped counting the requests from journalists, book agents, and Hollywood producers eager to turn her story into content. The attention felt parasitic, people profiting from trauma that continued to ripple through thousands of lives. "Ms. Schmidt?" A voice behind her made Charlotte turn. A woman in her 60s approached the sedan, her face etched with the kind of exhaustion that comes from sleepless nights and financial ruin. "I'm Margaret Chen," the woman said. "I invested my retirement savings in VelocityPay. I wanted to thank you." Charlotte felt her throat tighten. "Ma'am, I'm so sorry for your loss." "Don't be sorry," Margaret said firmly. "What you did took courage. My money is gone, but at least I know the truth. That matters." Other victims had been less gracious. Charlotte had received death threats from investors who blamed her for the company's collapse, rather than crediting her with exposing the fraud. Online forums debated whether she was a hero or a traitor, whether she should have acted sooner, whether her motivations were pure or self-serving. The federal grand jury testimony had been grueling. Hours of detailed questions about every aspect of the investigation, every conversation she'd recorded, every document she'd copied. David's defense team attempted to portray her as an unstable employee seeking revenge, but the evidence was overwhelming. Her recordings, combined with Elena's legal documents and Marcus's technical proof of fake user accounts, painted a comprehensive picture of systematic fraud. "The sentencing is next month," Rodriguez said as Margaret walked away. "Will you be attending?" Charlotte had been dreading this question. Victim impact statements were scheduled, and prosecutors had asked her to speak about the personal cost of uncovering the fraud. But facing David in court, seeing him one final time, felt like reopening wounds that had barely begun to heal. "I don't know. Part of me wants closure, but another part just wants to move forward." "There's no wrong choice," Rodriguez said. "You've already done more than anyone could reasonably expect." Charlotte's new life was taking shape slowly. She'd started a forensic accounting consultancy, using her VelocityPay experience to help other companies identify financial irregularities before they became criminal enterprises. The work was meaningful, but it came with constant reminders of the cost of corporate fraud. Her relationship with her father was slowly healing. Robert Schmidt had initially blamed himself for the investment losses, but Charlotte helped him understand that he was a victim of sophisticated manipulation, not a fool who should have known better. They were working together to rebuild his manufacturing business, using some of the reward money Charlotte had received from the SEC's whistleblower program. Marcus visited occasionally, their friendship changed but not broken by the shared trauma. He'd found work at a legitimate fintech company and spoke passionately about building ethical technology. Elena had moved to public interest law, using her corporate experience to help other whistleblowers navigate the legal system. "I have something for you," Rodriguez said, pulling an envelope from her jacket. "It's from the Justice Department. Official recognition of your contribution to the investigation." Charlotte opened the envelope and found a letter of commendation signed by officials whose names she recognized from news reports. The formal language praised her, quote, "exceptional courage in exposing complex financial crimes and her vital role in protecting the public interest." "Does it help?" Rodriguez asked, watching Charlotte read. "A little," Charlotte admitted. "But I think what helps most is knowing that other people won't lose their life savings to schemes like David's. That Marcus won't have to choose between his conscience and his career. That maybe the next whistleblower will have better protections because of what we learned from this case." As they drove away from VelocityPay's empty offices, Charlotte reflected on the strange mathematics of justice. David would spend decades in prison, but thousands of victims would never fully recover their losses. Her courage had protected future investors, but couldn't undo the damage already done. Truth had prevailed, but at a cost that would ripple through countless lives for years to come. Still, as Charlotte watched San Francisco's skyline pass by, she felt something she hadn't experienced since those first muted microphones. The quiet confidence that her voice mattered, that speaking truth to power was worth the price, and that sometimes the hardest choices led to the most necessary outcomes. The reckoning was far from over, but Charlotte Schmidt had learned to carry its weight. 18 months after David Thornfield's conviction, Charlotte stood before a congressional subcommittee in a hearing room that felt both familiar and surreal. The mahogany panels and stern faces reminded her of VelocityPay's boardroom, but this time she was the one presenting evidence that lawmakers desperately needed to hear. "Thank you for appearing before us today, Ms. Schmidt," the committee chairwoman said. "Your experience at VelocityPay has become a crucial case study in the need for enhanced whistleblower protections. Can you tell us about the personal cost you faced after coming forward?" Charlotte had testified dozens of times over the past year, but speaking before Congress carried special weight. These were the people who could change laws, strengthen protections, prevent future victims from facing the same impossible choices she'd confronted. Congresswoman Davis, the personal costs were significant, Charlotte began, her voice steady after months of practice. Death threats, career disruption, financial stress, and the psychological burden of knowing that doing the right thing couldn't undo the harm already done to thousands of investors. Quote, she outlined the gaps in current whistleblower legislation, the lack of interim financial support for informants whose careers were destroyed, the insufficient protection against retaliation, and the need for faster response times from regulatory agencies. Each recommendation grew from painful personal experience. During a break, Charlotte checked her phone and found a text that made her smile. Watching you on C-SPAN. Dad says you look like a senator. Marcus. Quote. Marcus Williams had become one of her closest friends through their shared trauma. His new company was thriving, and he'd recently been promoted to lead a team developing ethical AI frameworks for financial technology. Their friendship had been forged in crisis but had grown into something deeper, a shared commitment to preventing others from experiencing what they'd endured. Ms. Schmidt? A young woman approached during the lunch recess. I'm Jennifer Walsh from the SEC's Office of the Whistleblower. I wanted to thank you personally for your testimony. We've already received 3 new reports citing your case as inspiration to come forward. Charlotte felt a familiar mix of pride and sadness. Each new whistleblower represented someone else facing the same impossible choice between personal safety and public duty. Are they getting better support than I did? We're trying, Walsh said. Your recommendations about interim financial assistance are being seriously considered. The Schmidt protocols, that's what we're calling the new guidelines, should provide much better protection for future cases. The afternoon session focused on corporate accountability measures. Charlotte described how David's manipulation tactics had been refined over years of practice, how he'd systematically identified and exploited individual vulnerabilities to maintain silence and complicity. The most effective fraudsters aren't just stealing money, she told the committee. They're stealing agency from their victims, making people feel complicit, guilty, or powerless to act. Any legislative solution needs to address the psychological dimensions of corporate crime. After the hearing, Charlotte met with Agent Rodriguez at a quiet restaurant near Capitol Hill. Their relationship had evolved from law enforcement professional and informant to something approaching friendship, bonded by the shared experience of navigating a complex case with national implications. How are you feeling about the testimony? Rodriguez asked. Hopeful. For the first time since this started, I feel like the system might actually change in ways that matter. Rodriguez nodded, but Charlotte caught a flicker of concern in her expression. There's something you should know. We received word today that several VelocityPay victims are filing a civil lawsuit naming you as a defendant. Charlotte's stomach dropped. What's the allegation? Negligent delay in reporting. They're claiming you had a duty to expose the fraud sooner, and that your delay cost them additional losses. It's legally weak, but emotionally understandable. People need someone to blame. The news stung, but Charlotte had been expecting something like this. Victim anger was a predictable part of whistleblower aftermath, and some of David's victims would never forgive her for not acting fast enough to save their investments. Will it affect the congressional testimony? Probably not. But it might generate negative media attention. Are you prepared for that? Charlotte considered the question. 18 months ago, the thought of public criticism would have paralyzed her. Now, having survived congressional testimony, death threats, and career rebuilding, she felt more resilient. I'll handle it. The lawsuit doesn't change the fact that what we did was necessary. That evening, Charlotte returned to her hotel room and found an unexpected package. A handwritten letter from her father and a small wooden box containing her grandmother's wedding ring. My dear Charlotte, Robert Schmidt's careful handwriting read, I wanted you to have this before your testimony. Grandma always said it brought her courage during difficult times. She would be proud of the woman you've become. Your mother and I certainly are. The manufacturing business is recovering, and more importantly, we've learned that integrity matters more than profit. Thank you for teaching us that lesson, even though it came at such a high cost. Love, Dad. Charlotte slipped the ring onto her finger, feeling the weight of generations of Schmidt women who had faced their own impossible choices with quiet determination. Her phone rang with a call from Elena Vasquez, who had become a successful advocate for corporate transparency in her new role at a public interest law firm. Saw the hearing coverage, Elena said. You were magnificent. Any regrets about turning down the book deals? Charlotte laughed. Several publishers had offered substantial advances for her story, but she'd declined them all. The idea of profiting from trauma that continued to affect thousands of victims felt wrong. None. But I've been thinking about something else. What if we started a foundation, something to support other whistleblowers, provide financial assistance during investigations, maybe fund research into prevention strategies? I love it. Marcus mentioned something similar last week. With your experience, my legal background, and his technical expertise, we could actually make a difference. As they discussed possibilities for the foundation, Charlotte felt something she hadn't experienced since her Stanford graduation. Genuine excitement about the future. Not the desperate hope of survival that had sustained her through the investigation, but the calm confidence of someone who had found her calling. The civil lawsuit would be challenging, and there would undoubtedly be other obstacles ahead. David Thornfield was serving 22 years in federal prison, but the victims he'd created would carry scars for life. The financial recovery had been better than expected, nearly 50 cents per dollar, but many investors would never fully rebuild. Still, as Charlotte looked out at the Capitol dome illuminated against the Washington night sky, she felt profound satisfaction. 3 new pieces of whistleblower legislation were moving through Congress. The SEC had implemented stronger protections for financial crime informants. Her forensic accounting firm was helping dozens of companies identify and prevent fraud before it reached criminal levels. Most importantly, other potential whistleblowers were finding their courage. The system was changing, slowly but measurably, because someone had been willing to speak truth to power when silence would have been safer. Charlotte Schmidt had learned that heroism wasn't a single moment of courage. It was the daily choice to keep moving forward, despite the cost, to build something better from the wreckage of what came before. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she was ready for them. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.